I want to start by saying, last week we talked about what people seek in a relationship, those 17 things. And we talked about when this was done. And I went back and looked at it, and it was done January 2022. So it was after COVID, of course, committed. We talked about that not being on this list. That committed work, and I understand why. Part of that is because as we come out of COVID, we were having a tough time being committed to relationships, for one thing. We've been closed in for so long, it just created that issue. The other thing is the youth do not want to feel committed today in relationships. That's what they were explaining partway through that whole article, is that's why the word committed, probably more like not used, that the youth don't want to feel that committed dedication, that they don't want to kind of tie that to a relationship word. So that's why that word was left out. Okay? So that was January 2022. And what I want to say is last week we talked about relationships. We talked about quite a bit about relationships, what we want out of a relationship, what we need out of a relationship, what a relationship is, and how it forms, how it's made, those sort of things. And so last week we ended with Morgan Scott Peck and his thing. And I'm going to start right there where we ended with him. I'm not going to give you his history again. I'm not going to do all that. But I am going to do those two paragraphs. We're going to start there, and I'm going to read them out to you. Kind of. I read a lot. I know that I don't have that. I kind of have to know that was crazy, right? But I had short-term memory issues from when I had my stroke. So I can't remember a lot right off the bat. So you're going to see that a lot from me. I'm sorry. It's not that I don't know the material. I've known it this many times. It's just that somewhere down the line, I get lost in the moment. Okay? My brain doesn't work that way anymore. So, now, Morgan Scott Peck. I told you that he had wrote a book. The book was The Road Less Traveled. It's a case study of all the things, all the years that he had studying relationships, all kinds of relationships. Okay? It was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller for 13 straight years. Says a lot. And it sold more than 5 million copies, which again, says a lot. 5 million copies, a lot of books to sell out over those years. And as I said, his specialty was how relationships are formed, especially spiritual relationships. His idea was that discipline is the means of spiritual evolution or growth. And what gives discipline the needed energy is motive, the energy is love. Okay? Now, as I said, you'd be the first to admit there are many definitions of love, and love is divided into various categories: eros, phileo, agape, perfect love, imperfect love. But his definition of true love is the will to extend one's self for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another spiritual growth. Sounds a lot like agape, right? Sounds a lot like agape. In spiritual growth, love drives discipline to uplift oneself or another spiritually. It is the act of extending one's limits, and that takes effort. A person extends their limits only by exceeding them. We walk that extra mile or take those extra steps, and we know that from Jesus, right? That's what he talked about. Taking those extra steps, walking the extra mile. After all, love is not effortless, but effortful. By extending their limits, a person grows. The act of loving is an act of self-evolution, even when the purpose of that act is someone else's spiritual growth. And then finally, love is an act of will, with both intention and action. And of course, will also implies choice. We can choose to love or not to love another. Okay? That's not all Peck said, though, and I'm going to bring that up here coming in. Now, we often say that love is giving our heart to another. The problem is we are constantly protecting our hearts from being hurt. This protection or barrier comes from a combination of our values, morals, and ethics. Values are a person's ability to judge between right and wrong It's a deep-rooted system that guides a person's decisions. Morals come from our values and set the standard of behavior and belief concerning what is and what is not acceptable for them personally to do. And then ethics determines what behaviors or beliefs are right or wrong. Okay? Now, when a person says, I'm falling in love, this is according to Peck now, what most people mean by falling in love isn't love at all. He said when most people say, and this is from his studies, when most people say I'm falling in love, they're referring to a euphoric or sexual feeling, that physical attraction. It's that feeling that sends electric shock waves all through you when that person smiles at you or simply touches your hand. And we find that people fall in love easily and fall out of love just as easily. Peck says that true love begins when the falling in love feelings end and you accept that person with all their faults and all of your faults, and you still choose to love them. You have the will. Now, this is where the barriers come in. This is going to be important throughout our entire lesson. This is what Peck was talking about when he talks about barriers. And he goes in great detail. It's chapter after chapter, but I'm going to try to get this down in about a 10-minute speech. All right? Now, barriers. They're there to protect you around your heart. Okay? They protect your heart, your emotions, all those things. Now, when people go out to search for that special someone, they bring with them a barrier of protection that surrounds them to protect their hearts. And again, that barrier is made up of our values, morals, and ethics. When you meet that special someone, these barriers, you're protecting your heart, what happens is you let those barriers fall. And we've seen that, right? We see that a lot with people who fall in love. What's the first thing they do? They act kind of giddy. They act funny, right? They do anything for that person in that moment. And their barriers all fall. And you've exposed your heart, and you've exposed yourself, right? So those barriers fall. Now, one or two things will happen over a period of time. First is that person eventually does something or says something that irritates you. That teeth-clenching thing that you just can't accept. Okay, so that like that teacher scratching the chalkboard, right, coming down, that thing irritates you. It can happen. And what happens is your barriers start to come back up. They start to form around your heart one by one by one, and they keep coming until they protect your heart, your feelings. And that relationship's got to end. You say, I don't love you anymore. I can't accept you in my barriers. We aren't compatible. You are not compatible with my values, morals, and ethics. So I can't accept you in my barrier. And that happens, right? We see that a lot. We see that a lot. Now, the second possibility is that someone special steps inside your barriers. You've let them down and you've exposed yourself. And after some time, you grow to accept them within your barriers. You find common ground, okay? And you stay in that falling in love stage. And eventually, the two of you get married, and together over time, you build this set of barriers, a married couple, they build this set of barriers through compromise that they both can accept. These barriers that they both can happen, right? And these barriers are going to be important. And I'll tell you why. It'll be throughout the lessons. So, you've got this compromise that both of you can accept. Now, you both live within that system of barriers that you have created and share in, that you feel safe in, you trust in, and believe in that system that you two have built together. Okay? Then, within that system of love, values, morals, and ethics together, you decide, or sometimes undecided, that you want to share that with someone else. So a child is born. Okay? Within that boundary, after years of marriage, your child accepts your love, your values, your morals, and your ethics. Sometimes fully, sometimes partially, some not at all. And then they form their own set of barriers. But throughout your lifetime, those set of barriers become flexible. Okay? And I'm gonna use another example here later on, so just hang on. Your lifetime, those flexibles become flexible as you have son-in-laws and daughter-in-laws and mother-in-laws and father-in-laws and grandchildren all coming in and intertwining in your life. Now, let's say, for instance, your daughter marries someone that you aren't politically compatible with. You really don't like this person at all, and you don't like what they're spewing. But every Thanksgiving, you still have to invite him to dinner, right? You may not like him, you may not like his views, but you invite him to dinner, and you want to keep peace. So you compromise your barriers at some point. Same thing happens at Christmas time, right? You look at the person and say, I don't want to buy that guy anything. You don't want to be too kind because you don't really accept him or her or whoever that person is, a grandchild, whatever it may be. You really aren't just compatible. And we have people like that in our family, right? Don't we all have people like that in our family that something, they rubbed you the wrong way? Maybe it's your own child. And but every Thanksgiving, I don't care. It's like I always say, I don't care. Every Thanksgiving, me and my daughters, my one daughter, I can't see eye to eye on her politically on any level. But I love spending time with her. She's my daughter, and she's my firstborn. And I love spending time with her. So we have agreed, both of us, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion. We will talk about everything else, but we are not going to talk about those things. And so we've kept peace. I have compromised my barriers, what I believe, right? I've compromised a great deal just to spend time with her. And that's why I say, we all compromise. We all get that, right? Don't we all have that at holidays? Things like that. It happens to all of us. Barriers. So you compromise how you interact with all these people as they intertwine with your life. Some things, like I said, you can accept, some you don't. Some you agree with, some you can't. But the barriers are always present. But there's always an exception, just like this one, okay? Another couple start with the same love, morals, ethics, values, this other family. But somewhere down the line, one of them decides to step outside those barriers. And one of the parents decides to have an affair. Okay? They have chosen this act over time and mostly in secret. They no longer see the love, values, morals, and ethics the same way they used to with that partner. And when the other spouse finds out, they are hurt, broken, and instantly both parties involved form their own set of barriers from this sudden lack of trust, of respect, this lack of respect, lack of love. And the injured party becomes hurt, terrified, angry, creating doubt and distrust within that person and with their partner, right? Confusion, pain, and much more. But what has happened is the hurt party instantly, him or her, instantly throws up those barriers and protects their heart. They're sitting there saying, this is never going to happen again. I don't want this to happen. I'm hurting. I'm in pain. And I'm going to protect my heart at all costs. Right? And then you have the other person who the constant badgering from the wife is standing there taking that, and he or she may get defensive, trying to defend what they did, trying to find answers. They may be trying to reconcile, but it's awful hard, so they set up their own barriers to protect their own feelings, their own heart. Okay? Now, we see that they both have created their own set of barriers to protect their heart, their feelings, and their pain, and that happens. Now, the ones that suffer are the children. This is all according to Peck, and these barriers become important later on. Children begin to develop their own set of barriers through childhood, and some even into adulthood. We as parents must help them develop healthy barriers. If we don't help them set these barriers in place, society will. Okay? Children are most impressionable in their early teens. If the parents in the marriage are loving, nurturing, and stay together, it becomes much easier to develop a sense of discipline, love, values, morals, and ethics. If a child goes through that experience of one parent being unfaithful to another, they tend to distrust their parents' values, morals, and ethics, and instead seek those things out by what society offers, right? So they find how to protect their heart somewhere else because they don't believe what's happened here, the distrust that's happening, the anger in the child. They don't trust that. So they form their own set of barriers through their friends, through their experiences, what has happened to them, and they form their own set of barriers. Now, God is the one that sets our discipline, love, morals, and values in place when we become Christians. When we become a new Christian, we take on God's standards of love, morals, ethics, and values. We guard our hearts from the world, but God doesn't protect his heart. You see, God's love is perfect, as is his values, morals, and ethics. God's perfect love casts out all fear. See, he has no fear of his heart, right? Like we do. So he knows that he has done all he can to get you to choose to come to him. He knows that he has put up the perfect plan of salvation for you. So he knows that I don't have to protect my heart, right? But as you will see throughout this lesson, as we go on, this series of lessons, God's heart can be hurt. And he can get pretty angry about it sometimes. But he can be hurt. Okay? Now, this was my example about barriers in a marriage or family setting. But our barriers are always present. I want to give another example real quick. For example, you yourself or a friend or someone has told a secret to someone they thought would be safe telling the secret to. But later you found out it got out. And it was embarrassing, or hurtful, or shameful. And you, or their barriers, what happens to us? They come flying up to protect ourselves, right? They come flying up to protect ourselves. And you hear that person say, "Never again will that happen to me. Never again will I tell that person a single thing. I will never share a secret with them again." And you see that barrier that was around their heart and feelings thickens just a little bit. And it makes it much harder, much, much harder for someone to get close to them, to build a relationship with them. Now, we think about barriers and what barriers set us apart from God, right? In our own hearts. We set barriers. We have barriers of what? Sin, right? That allow us not to have a relationship with God. We have barriers of all kinds, and I'm gonna ask you about those. If you can come up with some more in just a little bit here. Okay. So, as I said, as these things happen to us and we experience these things that happen around us, our barriers become thicker. And it's a little harder to get to know that person. We use that same thing against God sometimes. And that's where I'm going to stop with barriers. They're going to be throughout, we're going to talk about them a little bit probably throughout each lesson. There's a little bit about that. I knew something about that years ago. I learned about barriers years ago from a friend who told me about this book and shared it with me. And so I learned that concept quite some time ago. But are there any questions or comments to that? Anything anybody wants to add or ask? And I will do my best to answer it. Nothing. Oh, Brenda, go ahead.
I think one of the other things, I mean, we put up the barrier of sin ourselves, but I think another barrier that you see in the Old Testament that they put up is that they deny God's existence, and that creates a barrier. You know, like when they turn to idols and stuff, they kind of are turning away from God and towards something really isn't a God, but it still creates a barrier. Sure. And again, that's of our own making.
And think about that. As their experiences, they see them as the Israelites go on and move forward, right? They wanted to be like everybody else, right? They wanted to be like these other nations. And when God says, listen, I give you the 10 Commandments, I want you to behave in a certain way. And this is what the 10 Commandments were, was I want your behavior to be in the light of these other nations and have this understanding that we act a certain way. But when they don't, that creates a barrier because, listen, I have a widow over here. Her husband just died, and she's renting the place for me. But you know what? I'm not making any money. She doesn't make an income. So out she goes. And that breaks God's law. Or when it comes to that end of the year, that 7th year, when they say, hey, this field we're supposed to lay fallow. We're not supposed to take any grain from it, and we're supposed to leave that for the poor and the edges so they could pick up and have some way to make money and feed themselves. And they say, no, get out of my field. I have to make a profit on this. And they did those things. And they say, hey, loans at 25%. I mean, that's unheard of, right? Yeah, loans at 25 to 27% for their own people. So, yeah, you can see how their experiences, how those barriers kept them from seeing God, right? Morgan.
A lot of times you'll see guilt and shame throwing up a barrier between you and God. I know in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. You're ashamed of something you've done, and you know what? Here's the thing. I don't want to have to tell it. I don't want to have to go before the church and repent for something, or I don't want to come to that pew. You're too ashamed, right? And you're too ashamed of what you've done. So those set barriers in place that allow us to not build a relationship with God. Those barriers become important. And we all have them. We all have them. Sometimes we thicken them a little when we get hurt, and sometimes we don't think about them at all. That's why you see some people are so flighty, right? They fall in love, in and out of love, and they're bouncing everywhere. They don't have much for barriers, right? They learn something else. But then you have some people who are tough, right? Their barriers, I'm not getting close to you. Get back. I don't want to get married. I don't want to have children. I don't want these things. I want a career. They're very selfish in their barriers and what they do. And they become very worldly. Brenda.
Anger is another one. You know, I've seen people leave the church, get so angry at God because mama died or my child died, and they get very angry and they leave the church and they turn away from God. They blame him for what happened.
Yeah. They feel it's unanswered prayers, and they want answers for their things on their time, and that's not the way God works. God works on his time. So yeah, there's something there. There is something there. All right. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Gary.
It's true also. There's those that don't commit to God. They say they don't believe in God, but as soon as something goes wrong in their life, you know, they're asking others to pray. Well, who are they praying to? You know, if you don't believe in God, why are you praying to a God?
And you see people, like you're talking about, who blame God for all these catastrophes that happen around the world. Tsunamis and earthquakes and all these things. If there's a God up there, why doesn't he stop all this suffering? Why doesn't he take away all our pain? Why doesn't he do all these things if there's a God up there? And so it sets that barrier, right? Sets that doubt. Okay? So yeah, we all have barriers one way or another. We all protect our feelings. We all protect our heart. But God doesn't have those barriers. And we're going to see that as we go through these lessons. Okay? Anything else? Okay. Now, I'm going to go on to the next lesson. And the next lesson we're talking about is knowing God, what it means. Okay? So, last week we discussed relationships, what we want from them, how they are formed, what inhibits them, and what happens when they are broken. This week we want to take a closer look at those connections, and particularly our relationship with God. Our human relationships are formed with people we know, people we went to school with, people we work with, people we share common interests with, people we meet, or people we're introduced to. It is this word know we want to take a look at, and one that, as I said last week, we tend to throw around very loosely. You may say, if I ask you, you know Tom Brady? Yeah, I know Tom Brady. You know Harrison Ford? Yeah, I know Harrison Ford. Well, have you ever sat down, had a meal? No, you've never shared any moment with them. But you know these people, right? You've seen them on TV. You know all the things that they've done, but you really don't know them. Like a relationship, close know, right? So from the human perspective, the word know can cover a range of meaning. Okay? And let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, I'm going to use this example with my wife, Crystal. Okay? If I told you Crystal's favorite color was yellow, would that tell you much about Crystal?
Sunshine.
Yeah, you might say she's my sunshine, right? But no, it's not going to say much about Crystal. If I told you her favorite flower was yellow roses, would that tell you much about Crystal?
He's from Texas.
If I told you Crystal was a lifelong San Francisco Giants fan, no matter how deluded she is, would that tell you much about Crystal?
We pray for
Exactly. Go Dodgers. So those are things that are superficial, right? That's what we kind of call a level 1 question. Now, if I told you she was allergic to amoxicillin and sulfa drugs, you would know a little bit more about her then, wouldn't you? You would know a little bit more personal things. If I told you she was a social butterfly, just the opposite of me, if I told you she was a social butterfly, you would even know a little bit more. That she can carry a conversation with you. And she's going to come up and greet you. She's going to come to your, how are you? Who are you? How can I help you kind of thing. You know, I'm not that way. I'm more like, I grew up with my mom. Unless you put your hand out, I hardly ever put it out there. I put them in my pockets. I'm not small talk kind of person. I'm just not that, I'm not built that way. Now, I could tell you then now a great deal more about Crystal. When I said, if I told you that Crystal has a passion for writing, that she is a freelance writer and writes for a local newspaper and a historical society, that tells you a little bit more, doesn't it? You know a little bit more about Crystal. And you could learn more if I told you Crystal is addicted to reading and collecting books. We have bookcases in our house and books in boxes standing on the floor. She is a collector. That would tell you a little bit more about Crystal. And I could tell you, and Don will witness this, I can tell you when we moved to our place of living in Davis, Don Farmer, who stages houses for people, was helping us arrange our furniture in the living room. And when she got done, she said, this is the perfect way to arrange your furniture. And I looked at Don, and I said, that won't do. I said, what? I said, that won't do. Because when Crystal and I are sitting down to watch TV, we like to hold hands. We hold hands when we watch TV. We got to sit next to each other. That may sound funny, but you know what? In our past relationships, our partners didn't want to hold hands, so that means a great deal to us. So in our living room, when we sit down, watch TV, she sits in one chair, I sit in another, but we got to hold hands. That tells you a great deal about Crystal, right? That tells you more about her, more personal. And then, I could tell you even more about Crystal. After we were married only 3 months, we barely knew each other when we got married. We didn't have a long courtship, okay? We fell in love and romance more or less. Anyway, we'd been married only 3 months. The first big thing happened in our marriage was her mother passed away. I was called home from work. And I was her rock for a few months, holding and caring for her. While she wept and told stories about her mom, shared them with her sisters, went through her mother's things and her memories a great deal. She went through a lot. And I listened and I realized how lucky I was to marry her and how lucky I was to marry in such a wonderful family. So after I tell you these things, down at the bottom, you know a little bit more about Crystal, right? The experiences, the only way you can build a relationship is through experiences, through getting to know someone through the hard times, through the good times. Those times are spent together. You see, it takes time, love, commitment, communication, honesty, experience, and experiences you share in that build enough trust to allow an intimate relationship to form. You see, a house is built on a strong foundation, and then it's built board by board, brick by brick. And in the same way, our relationships are built on a strong foundation over time, board by board, brick by brick, by spending quality time with each other over the years. And that's how you form that intimate relationship. That's how it works. Okay? Any questions? Anything from there? Not doing a lot of talking, people. No, I understand. So, this is where I think we're going to get into a little bit deeper of what it means to know. What does the word mean to know God? Now, we are trying to understand and know God through the Old Testament. So the definition we are going to use is, of course, Hebrew. The Hebrew word for to know or to know something is yada. Yada, Y-A-D-A. And there is a significant difference between the Hebrew word yada and the English word know that has a profound impact, on our understanding of the most important Christian idea. I remember last week, back there, Mrs. Harbach, she was back there, Karen, she told us that Spanish had two meanings for the word know, right? She had two different words that had two different meanings. The Hebrew word is very, very much dealt into know, and it very much has to do with intimacy. I'm going to show that to you. Okay? So we're going to look at a couple verses here and a couple different stories to help us look at and understand this word. So let's turn to Genesis 4:1. Genesis 4:1. And I'm going to read this. I want to read this from the King James Version, or the New King James Version, or some of the other versions, because it uses this word. And this is the correct translation of this word. In Genesis 4:1, it says, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord." So Adam knew Eve. Now, just as information, I just want to share this with you real quick because this is important. The same word in the scripture aforementioned here in Genesis 4:1 is the exact same word yada, where David writes in Psalms 139:23, and when he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." Same word, know my heart, yada, right? Same word. We're talking about intimacy here. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. Know intimately, right? He's talking about intimacy. It is the same Hebrew word yada used here for Adam knowing Eve, his wife. Now, this is going to get good here. The Hebrew word for to know is yada. So then Adam yada Eve, his wife. What this verse is saying is that Adam knew his wife. And what happens is, she conceived and bore a son, Cain. So what this word is referring to, yada, is referring to sex. They had sex, right? I mean, Cain is not the result of some understanding that Adam had about Eve, some mysterious understanding or mysterious knowledge. It's not, right? So yada, this Hebrew word, is not just understanding things about someone or understanding things in general. It is not a physical exercise, but a mental exercise to know someone intimately. That's what that yada means. Okay? Yada is an intimacy relationship word. Okay? And again, yada, I want to say it, is an intimacy relationship word. It is an intimacy of the heart and mind. The word yada is concretely being used here to describe a relationship between a husband and a wife having sex, the most intimate experience we can have as humans. Now, this is an adult class, and so hang with me. Sexual intercourse is for two people who know each other intimately. Okay? They know things about each other that no one else in the world would know. They share their deepest thoughts and secrets with each other and keep no secrets from each other, nor lie to each other or have hidden agendas. Adam and Eve ended up conceiving by knowing each other so well that it led to love. And all love involves a deep knowing of someone. Knowing that person well enough that you trust that person with your life. To trust that person with your most hidden secrets. When you know someone intimately, you trust them and you bond with them. You naturally love that person. But without love, there can be no intimacy. Okay? Jesus shows us an example of this mental exercise. If you'll turn with me to Matthew 5, 27 through 28. Matthew 5, verses 27 through 28. Would anybody like to read that? Okay, I'll read it. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay? Now, to look upon a woman, what that word is, it's an Arabic word. I think it's raza or ratzka, I can't remember. It's one of those two. What that means is to look. And what it generally means is you look upon a woman and not touch. But you look upon her. And that means in order to commit this adultery, you have to look upon something that is not normally visible to you. Okay? Or, simply put, what do you have to do? You have to fantasize about this woman for adultery to take place here. This man doesn't touch this woman. He does this in his heart and in his mind. So to commit that adultery, he has to, it's a mental act, not a physical one. Right? It's a mental act, not a physical one. Right? So this becomes a mental exercise, not a physical one. In other words, in the eyes of Jesus, the focus of a sexual relationship is mental, not physical. Not saying that we don't have that physical when we're married, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's still a mental exercise to know that person well enough that you can be intimate with them that close. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions? Think about that for a second and let it set in. Intimacy, right? It is mental, it's not physical. So, this word yada is used in context we would never use in English. But we see it appears in another very important story, and we're going to bring that up. But I want to start talking about something that kind of adds to this stories that I want to bring. And what I want you to think about is metaphors for God. So when we think about some of the metaphors that describe God, what do you think of? When we think of the metaphors that describe our God, what do we think of?
Loving.
What's that?
Loving.
Loving. Loving God.
Jealous.
Jealous. He can be a jealous God. He's jealous for us, ain't he? He sees value in us, even when we can't see value in ourselves.
Just.
What's that?
Just.
Just. Kenny. Protective. Yeah, he's protective, right? Adjectives to describe. I'm going to throw out a few that I was thinking about when I was thinking about it. We think about God as our Heavenly Father, right? We think about God as the ultimate heavenly parent. We think about God as our shepherd, Kenny said, protector, right? We think about God as our king. And all these metaphors that we talk about and think about are very helpful, very great, very biblical, and very helpful in helping us understand our relationship with God. But now I'm going to ask you another question. Last week, I asked you to think about what word or metaphor would you use to describe your relationship with God? Don?
I trust him.
Trust. Your relationship with God, you're trusting. You trust each other. Anyone else? A metaphor. Think about it. Last week, Derek hit on it in a great deal, what Derek said last week. And he already knows. Did anybody listen? Did anybody remember? Crystal.
He said it was like a marriage.
It's like a marriage, right? It's like a marriage. It's like a marriage. Anybody else? Morgan.
Long-suffering.
Long-suffering. Our relationship is long-suffering with God, sometimes. Sure. Because we live on God's time, not our own, right? We live on God's time.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
And he's long-suffering with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's like a father-son, father-child relationship, but with the intimacy of a marriage, in that you're close in your mind and your spirit. That's how I would see it.
Yeah. Yeah, very intimate. It should be very intimate with God.
Because not all father-children relationships are good.
And we don't think about it that way. We don't think about being intimate with God in that way, do we? But we should be. Because that's what God is asking for. And those verses are going to show that in just a minute here. Now, I think many would be tempted to say, maybe God is our parent, or like Brenda said, father-son relationship. And there is a good argument for that, and probably a fantastic one. But like I said, I think it's marriage. That is the most powerful metaphor for our relationship with God. And like Derek had mentioned last week, we see this in the New Testament where Paul writes about this, or John writes about this, where Paul talks about our relationship as husband and wife is like Jesus' relationship with the church. And in Revelation, where John paints a picture of the church being the bride coming to Jesus. But we are trying to know God through the Old Testament. So I want us to turn to Hosea. I want us to turn to Hosea, where God compares Israel, his people, to a bride, and God himself to a groom. Now, when we read these scriptures, we will see they are married together, and things have not gone well in this marriage. And that is a powerful analogy that he uses, which is not uncommon because it appears many times in the Bible. So let's turn to Hosea 2, 19 through 20. Now, just to set up a little bit of history here, these people have been extremely unfaithful to God. Okay? And they are about to go in exile. This is Israel. He says here, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion. And I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. And then you will know, yada, right? Yada. You will know the Lord. That's talking about something intimate when he's talking about betrothed to me. Right? I will betroth you to me. You will be wed to me. Right? So, the whole analogy here, again, is a marriage one. And like it says, things have not gone well throughout this marriage. We've already seen that concrete sense what Yadai refers to in Genesis 4:1 that we talked about. So when you say you will know the Lord, what he is saying, what he is talking about, is you will have that intimate relationship with him. That's what it's about. He's talking to Israel here. That's what it's about. I will betroth myself to you. He is saying we're going to be in a marriage together. And in fact, that is what has been happening. But you haven't been faithful to me. You haven't been faithful at all. So again, we see that it's more than a father-son relationship. It's more like what is found in a marriage, that closeness and understanding that exists between a husband and a wife. Let's turn to Isaiah 54:4. Isaiah 54:4. Would someone like to read that for me? Please. No one? Jeff, thank you. Appreciate it.
For your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth.
Yeah. What does the scripture portray? It portrays our relationship with God as a marriage, right? That's what it's portraying here. As a married couple, you say things to each other and come to a closeness with each other. You talk about things you don't talk about with other people. You share your dreams, your fears, your mistakes, the things you love, because you feel safe with that person. This not only helps you understand each other on a level no one else can reach or touch, but it draws you very close to one another. For example, how many times have you been out together and something happens? You see a child at a counter trying to get a toy, screaming its head off, wanting a toy or a piece of candy. And a young mother can't control this child, right? She just can't seem to get control of the situation. Or you're at a doctor's office, and there's two children there, and one child picks up a toy and throws it at the other kid and hits him in the face, right? Seen that happen. Not on purpose, but it does happen. The other child's screaming its head off. You just can't seem to control the situation you're in. And the two of you, the husband and wife, you just looked at each other knowing what the other is thinking. You exchange that look or expression that conveys you both feel the same about what just happened. And you do it without one word being exchanged. How many times have we done that as a married couple? Many, many times, right? We don't want to get involved, but we definitely know what's going on. Hold on, Morgan, I'll get right with you. It is the idea that their hearts and minds are so connected at that point that they are one. We've all had that experience at one point or another, right? You don't want to get involved with what's going on with this young mother or something happening, but you look at each other and go, man, I've been there. And you know what each other is thinking. Many situations we've been like that, right? You don't have to say a word. You know what each other is thinking. You know each other that well. Morgan.
So I'm gonna throw you a curve here. So how does fear work into that?
How does what?
Fear.
Fear.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, no?
Yeah.
So how does fear work into our relationship with God as well as our fear of our relationship with one another in a marriage?
How does fear work?
How does fear work into that?
I have to think about that. I don't think fear works in it. Listen, I'll give you an analogy real quick. And I was going to save this for another time, and I was going to save this for Tuesday night with Brenda, but I'm going to share this with you. And this is how I feel it goes. And then, Jeff, I'll get to you. This is an analogy that I have with our relationship with God. I've been thinking about this all week long. And I want you to think about a storm. Okay? I want you to think about a storm. How many of us have seen a great big storm coming? Many, right? And we look in the distance and we see that storm coming. And we see that lightning strike from a distance. We see it light up the sky. We see the power that's happening. And what's that like for us? It's beautiful, right? It's majestic when it's at a distance. It's beautiful when it's at a distance. It's majestic. It's authoritative. But then we feel the rush of that wind coming to us and the storm's coming to us. And what happens to us? We begin to get a little apprehensive, don't we? Oh, the storm's coming. What'll I do? Should I get in the basement? Maybe it could be a tornado. How strong is this storm? But it's coming near, and you feel that uneasiness. That feeling you get when you heard that saying, something wicked this way comes, right? You get that uneasy feeling because you don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to go to the east or the west or the north or the south? Is it going to pass by my house, or is it coming right at me? but then the storm comes to you. All right? The storm comes to you. And how many have been in the middle of a lightning storm? Very close. Lightning strikes. I have. I've been the one that hit less than 8 feet from my house. It reminded me that I was sitting there when I was on Davis Road at the house, and the lightning struck our pond as I was looking at it through the window. And as soon as that struck, I turned away in fear, not knowing where it was going to go. Was it going to hit me? Was it going to bounce and hit me? So I turned in fear and tucked away. Okay? I turned in fear and walked away because I was afraid of its power, of what was there in the moment. Okay? I'm going to use this analogy like God. When we see God in the distance, he looks beautiful. He looks majestic. He looks authoritative. But as God starts coming close, if you don't know him, it creates that apprehension, right? If you don't know him, it creates that fear. And then when it comes close, if you don't know God and that lightning strikes, you see its power. The ground shakes. Lightning fills the room. It's all those things happening at once in that room, right? It's all those things happening. And you can feel fear if you don't know God or don't know that power. Or you know what? In the moment, if you know it, then you can feel relaxed and at peace. And it's not fear anymore if you know God. Right? Because perfect love, God's perfect love, casts out all fear. I got Brenda's, and I think that's it for me. I think they're telling me I got to get rid of class. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't hear the buzzer go off.
I think if you go back to what he betrothed you in righteousness, justice, loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness, those qualities, if you develop those qualities, I think that casts out a lot of that fear. Because perfect love casts out any fear. And
Tough. Yeah. Something we develop, but it don't happen overnight, right?